As Europe was engulfed in turmoil, the most dangerous and unexpected weapon in Adolf Hitler's arsenal wasn't a tank or a plane. It was a woman, a master diplomat, a brilliant opportunist, and, ironically, Jewish. She was Princess Stephanie von Hohenlohe. She wasn't a soldier or a hardened ideologue. She was a new kind of weapon, wrapped in Parisian couture and armed with devastating charm. Her entire life was a relentless, high-stakes climb from a middle-class background to the absolute center of European power. She traded secrets in the drawing rooms of London, brokered deals for the Nazi regime, and was rewarded with a castle for her loyalty. But the power she craved became a gilded cage, and her journey would end not in a palace, but in a Texas internment camp, branded an enemy of the state. This is the story of a master manipulator, a brilliant opportunist, and a woman who made a devastating pact with evil, all in the desperate search for a place to belong. To understand Stephanie, you must first understand the city that created her, a city that was itself a beautiful, complicated lie. Vienna, in the last gasping years of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Imagine it at the turn of the 20th century. It was the glittering capital of a vast multi-ethnic kingdom stretching across Central Europe. On the surface, it was a dreamscape, a city of waltzes composed by Strauss, of breathtaking palaces built for emperors, of cafes where intellectuals like Sigmund Freud and Gustav Klimt were redefining the very concept of the human mind. It was a city that had perfected the art of the facade, presenting a face of joyous, almost frivolous culture to the world. But beneath this polished veneer of music and art, Vienna was a cauldron of anxieties, a society rotting from the inside out with decadence and deep-seated prejudices. This was a world obsessed, pathologically so, with two things: bloodlines and money. Your name, your title was a skeleton key that opened every door. It was the absolute currency of power. And Stephanie Richter, born in 1891 to a respectable lawyer and his wife, possessed neither. She wasn't born a princess. She was born into the comfortable but unremarkable world of the Viennese bourgeoisie. Her family was educated, they had means, but in the rigid, almost feudal hierarchy of Vienna, they were permanently locked out of the inner sanctum. They could observe the aristocracy from a distance, but they could never truly join it. And for Stephanie, this was a form of suffocation. There was another layer to her identity, a secret she would learn to guard with the ferocity of a dragon protecting its gold. Her parents, Ludmilla and Johann Richter, were both of Jewish heritage. Though they had converted to Catholicism, raising their daughter in the faith, in the Vienna of that era, the stain of one's ancestry was considered indelible. This was the city of Mayor Karl Lueger, a populist politician who had risen to power by mastering a new and venomous form of political anti-Semitism. He openly called Jews an alien race and used them as scapegoats for the city's economic and social problems. This wasn't the genocidal anti-Semitism that would later engulf the continent, but it was its direct ancestor, a casual social and political poison that seeped into the very air of the city. For a young, ambitious woman like Stephanie, her hidden Jewishness was not just a piece of trivia. It was a ticking bomb, a fatal flaw that could detonate her ambitions at any moment. From her earliest years, Stephanie was acutely aware of these invisible walls, but she wasn't the kind of person to accept them. She was born with a formidable arsenal of assets. She was, by all accounts, breathtakingly beautiful, with piercing blue eyes, a statuesque figure, and a charisma that could disarm even the most cynical of men. More than that, she was ferociously intelligent. She was a keen observer of people, quickly learning the subtle codes of speech, dress, and behavior that separated the true aristocracy from the aspiring middle class. She possessed an ambition that was as vast and as fragile as the empire she lived in. Looking out from her family's comfortable apartment, she saw the grand carriages of the Esterházys and the Schwarzenbergs rolling by, and she didn't feel envy. She felt a profound, almost primal sense of recognition. She knew, with every fiber of her being, that was the world where she belonged. She wasn't content to watch the parade. She was determined to lead it. Her education was geared toward this goal. She became fluent in French and English, the international languages of the elite. She studied art, music, and literature. She mastered the art of conversation, learning how to be witty without being abrasive, how to flatter without being servile. She was crafting herself piece by piece into the perfect imitation of an aristocrat. She understood that if she couldn't be born into that world, she would have to conquer it. This era was known as the fin de siècle, the end of the century, and it was a time of profound cultural and political anxiety. The old certainties of the Habsburg Empire were dying. Nationalism was tearing at its multi-ethnic fabric. New radical ideas in art, science, and politics were challenging the established order. For the old guard, this was a terrifying time. But for a young woman like Stephanie, a brilliant outsider with nothing to lose, this instability wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity. If the old rules were breaking, it meant a clever, ruthless player could write new ones. She was a product of a dying empire, a society dancing at the edge of its own grave. And like a phoenix, she was determined to rise from its ashes, no matter who or what she had to burn along the way. Her entire youth was a rehearsal for the main performance, a long, patient sharpening of the weapons she would need for her conquest of high society. Her first major move was a masterpiece of social calculation, a gambit so audacious it left Viennese society breathless. As she blossomed into womanhood, her beauty became her primary weapon. She became a celebrated figure in the city, but she was careful. She understood that a mere dalliance with an aristocrat would lead nowhere. It would tarnish her reputation and leave her with nothing. She was not seeking a lover. She was seeking a crown. She set her sights on the ultimate prize. She didn't just aim for a count or a baron. She aimed for a prince. His name was Prince Friedrich Franz von Hohenlohe-Waldenburg Schillingsfürst. He was everything she was not. A German diplomat attached to the Austro-Hungarian court, he was a member of one of Europe's most ancient and respected royal houses, a Uridel family whose lineage stretched back to the Holy Roman Empire. He was tall, handsome in a stiff, formal way, and possessed a title so grand it was almost a caricature. He had the bloodline, the access, the automatic entry into every royal court on the continent. Everything Stephanie craved with a hunger that was almost physical. But Prince Friedrich Franz had a secret weakness, a flaw as deep and as compromising as Stephanie's own hidden heritage. He was a compulsive gambler, a man who lived a life of champagne and baccarat far beyond his means. He was drowning in debt, a fact that was becoming an open secret and a source of profound embarrassment for his ancient family. His financial situation was desperate. He needed an infusion of cash, and he needed it quickly. Stephanie, through her father's legal connections and her own remarkable, almost hypnotic powers of persuasion, had access to wealth. The exact details of the arrangement are lost to the mists of society gossip, but the essence of the deal was clear. It was less of a romance and more of a corporate merger. She, the brilliant and beautiful commoner, would use her connections to secure the funds, to clear his gambling debts and restore his family's finances. In return, he, the pedigreed but profligate prince, would give her the one thing she could never earn on her own, his name. He would make her princess. It was a cold, calculated transaction, a trade of status for security. To modernize, it seems cynical, but in the world of the European aristocracy, such marriages were commonplace. They were alliances, business deals designed to consolidate power and wealth. Stephanie was simply playing the game by the established rules, but with an outsider's daring. In May of 1914, in a quiet ceremony in London, away from the prying eyes of the Viennese press, the deal was sealed. The wedding took place just weeks before a Serbian nationalist's bullet would assassinate an archduke in Sarajevo, plunging the entire continent into the inferno of the First World War. In that moment, Stephanie Richter, the lawyer's daughter from Vienna, ceased to exist. In her place stood Her Serene Highness, Princess Stephanie von Hohenlohe-Waldenburg-Schillingsfürst. She had done it. At the age of 22, she had stormed the fortress of European royalty and planted her flag on its highest turret. The timing was both impeccable and catastrophic. She had secured her title just before the old world that valued such things was about to be swept away forever. But the fairy tale, as she quickly discovered, was a complete and utter facade. The marriage was a disaster almost from the moment the vows were exchanged. The vast cultural and personal gulf between them was unbridgeable. He was a stiff traditional aristocrat who expected a quiet, obedient wife. She was a vibrant, ambitious, and intelligent woman who had no intention of being a decorative ornament. He was scandalized by her forwardness. She was bored to death by his formality. The outbreak of the Great War in August 1914 only exacerbated their differences. Prince Friedrich Franz, as a German diplomat and army officer, was immediately called away to service. Stephanie was left alone, a newly minted princess in a world suddenly consumed by conflict. But before the union completely dissolved, it produced one lasting result that would become the central focus of her life. In Vienna in December of 1914, she gave birth to a son whom she named Franz Josef, after the aging emperor. To his family and friends, he would always be known as Franzl. He was the legitimate heir to the Hohenlohe line, her living, breathing connection to the aristocracy. He would become the one constant, and perhaps the one genuinely humanizing element in his mother's tumultuous life. For the next 4 years, as Europe tore itself apart, Stephanie navigated a precarious existence. She was a princess, yes, but one whose husband was away at war and whose marriage was crumbling. She used her time wisely, however, honing her skills as a hostess, building a network of influential contacts among the diplomats and military officials who remained in the capital. She learned the art of gathering information, of understanding the subtle shifts in power. She was no longer just an ambitious girl. She was a player in a much larger, more dangerous game. By 1918, the war was over. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the world that had defined her youth, had vanished, shattered into a collection of small squabbling republics. Her husband returned from the front, but there was nothing left to salvage of their marriage. By 1920, they were officially separated, and their union was eventually annulled by the Roman Catholic Church on the grounds that they had never been truly compatible. This could have been the end of her story. A commoner who briefly became a princess during the chaos of war, now cast out and destined to be forgotten as the world tried to rebuild itself. But Stephanie had what she had come for. She had the title. The annulment did not strip it from her, and she would cling to it, brandish it, and monetize it for the rest of her life. And she had her son, Franzl. She was no longer just Stephanie Richter. She was a princess, the mother of a prince. The war had destroyed the old world, but it had also liberated her from a disastrous marriage. For Princess Stephanie, a new game on a new and much larger stage was just beginning. She had a title, a son, and an unquenchable ambition. The ruins of post-war Europe were not an obstacle. They were her new playground. In the aftermath of the Great War, as the old empires of Europe lay in ruins, Princess Stephanie did something incredibly smart. She correctly identified where the new center of global power was coalescing. It wasn't in defeated Berlin or impoverished Vienna. It was in London. And so, with her young son Franzel in tow, she left the continent and moved to the city that was rapidly becoming the political, financial, and social capital of the world. Imagine her arrival. She was a princess without a country, a royal without a fortune, a Catholic divorcee in a Protestant society. On paper, her prospects were bleak, but Stephanie had never allowed circumstances to define her. She possessed an arsenal of intangible assets: her imperious title, her still dazzling beauty, her razor-sharp wit, and a network of aristocratic contacts she had cultivated before and during the war. She also had a survivor's instinct, honed in the cutthroat social world of Vienna and the chaos of the imperial collapse. London in the 1920s was a city of stark contrasts. It was the heart of a victorious empire, but it was also a society deeply scarred by the loss of a generation of young men in the trenches. It was a place of wild hedonistic parties hosted by the bright young things, but also a place of profound political anxiety, haunted by the rise of Bolshevism in Russia and the simmering resentment of a defeated Germany. Into this volatile mix stepped Princess Stephanie. She took a modest apartment and began her campaign. Her strategy was the same one she had perfected in Vienna, but now executed on a grander scale. She began to host dinner parties. An invitation to one of Princess Stephanie's gatherings quickly became one of the most coveted social prizes in London. She had an almost magical ability to bring together the most interesting and powerful people. On any given night, one might find a conservative member of parliament locked in conversation with a controversial author, a wealthy industrialist sharing a drink with a visiting European royal, and a celebrated actress charming a senior military figure. She was the ultimate networker, the human hub at the center of a growing web of influence. It was in this glittering, high-stakes environment that she met the man who would become her most important patron, her political Svengali, and, for a time, her lover, Harold Harmsworth, the first Viscount Rothermere. Lord Rothermere was not just an aristocrat, he was a king-maker. As the owner of the Daily Mail and the Daily Mirror, he was a press baron of almost unimaginable power. His newspapers, with their sensational headlines and populist tone, shaped the opinions of millions of Britons every single day. He could build up a politician with favorable coverage or destroy a career with a single damning headline. He was vain, powerful, and deeply political. Rothermere was consumed by a singular political obsession. He believed with the fervor of a religious zealot that the Treaty of Versailles, which had formally ended the war, had been a catastrophic mistake. He saw it as unjustly punitive, particularly towards Germany, and even more so, Hungary, which had been stripped of 2/3 of its territory. He feared that a humiliated and impoverished Germany would inevitably fall prey to communism, a prospect that terrified him. His solution was a policy of appeasement and treaty revision. He used his newspapers as a sledgehammer to hammer this message home day after day. He wanted to see Germany and Hungary's borders revised, their national pride restored, and for them to be brought back into the family of European nations as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. In Princess Stephanie, Lord Rothermere found the perfect instrument to advance his cause. She was his living, breathing connection to the world he wanted to influence. She was German by marriage, a native German speaker, intimately familiar with the complex politics and personalities of Central Europe. She could open doors for him that would remain firmly shut to a British newspaperman. She could move through the salons and chancelleries of Berlin, Budapest, and Rome, gathering information and whispering his message into the ears of the powerful. For Stephanie, Rothermere was the key to a level of power and wealth she had only dreamed of. He was her protector, the powerful man she had been searching for her entire life. He lavished her with gifts, paid her a generous stipend, and installed her in a lavish permanent suite at the exclusive Dorchester Hotel, which became the de facto headquarters for her operations. She was no longer a struggling divorcee. She was Lord Rothermere's official emissary, his confidant, his political muse. Their relationship was a complex fusion of the personal and the political. They were lovers, but their intimacy was also a form of transaction. He provided the power and the platform. She provided the access and the charm. She began to travel across Europe on his behalf, carrying personal messages from Rothermere to heads of state. She became a particularly fierce advocate for Hungary, championing its cause for border revision. Her suite at the Dorchester became the unofficial Hungarian embassy in London, a place where visiting Hungarian politicians came to plead their case and strategize with Rothermere's powerful new agent. She was no longer just a socialite. She was a political operative, a lobbyist, moving in the shadows of international diplomacy. She was mastering the art of the back channel, learning how to trade in information, how to flatter and manipulate powerful men, and how to turn personal connections into political currency. She cultivated an air of mystery and importance. She would hint at secret meetings, at conversations with prime ministers, at knowledge of events before they happened. She was building her brand. During this period, she perfected her public persona. She was always impeccably dressed, favoring the latest Parisian couture. She was a permanent fixture on the best-dressed lists. She was a constant presence at the most exclusive parties, race meetings, and country house weekends. But behind the serene, smiling facade, her mind was constantly at work, observing, analyzing, and calculating her next move. She was collecting gossip, assessing weaknesses, and identifying opportunities. Her relationship with her son, Franzel, during these years was a complicated one. She adored him and provided him with the finest education money could buy, sending him to elite boarding schools in England and Switzerland. Yet her work constantly took her away from him. She was a mother who loved her son deeply, but who was also addicted to the thrill of the political game. Franzel grew up in the shadow of his glamorous, powerful, and often absent mother, a boy surrounded by luxury, but perhaps starved of simple maternal consistency. This London period was the crucible in which the Nazi princess was forged. It was here that she learned that her title and charm could be monetized, that she could be a player on the world stage. It was here that she became accustomed to a life of immense luxury and influence, a life funded by powerful men who expected results. And it was here that her politics began to drift decisively to the right. Surrounded by Rothermere and his circle of aristocratic appeasers, she became convinced that the strong authoritarian leaders emerging in Europe, like Mussolini in Italy, were the answer to the continent's problems. She saw democracy as weak and decadent. She longed for a powerful leader who could restore order and discipline. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, her work for Rothermere had made her a well-known figure in the foreign ministries of Europe. She had built a reputation as a discreet and effective political fixer. She was learning that in the increasingly unstable world of international politics, a well-placed princess with no official government portfolio, could be a very useful and deniable tool. She was about to offer her unique set of skills to a new and far more dangerous client, one who promised not just the revision of treaties, but the creation of a whole new world order. Her time as Rothermere's agent was a dress rehearsal. The main performance, the one that would define her life and ultimately destroy her, was about to begin. In the early 1930s, a dark new power was rising in Germany, born from the ashes of defeat and the resentments of the Treaty of Versailles. To many in the British establishment, Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party were a terrifying enigma, a movement of thuggish, brown-shirted street brawlers led by a failed artist with a comical mustache. They were seen as vulgar, dangerous, and profoundly unstable. But to Princess Stephanie, they were something else entirely. They were the future. She saw in the Nazi movement the discipline, the nationalistic fervor, and the authoritarian strength that she and her patron, Lord Rothermere, so admired. Here was a movement that promised to tear up the hated Versailles Treaty, restore German pride, and, most importantly, stand as an unbreakable wall against the threat of Soviet communism. For Stephanie, this wasn't a threat. It was a supreme opportunity, a new and powerful horse to which she could hitch her wagon. Her entry into this dark new world came through a man named Captain Fritz Wiedemann. Wiedemann was a key figure in Hitler's inner circle. He had been Hitler's company commander during the First World War and was now one of his most trusted personal adjutants. He was well-connected, discreet, and utterly devoted to the Führer. When he met Princess Stephanie, he was completely captivated. Here was a woman who embodied everything the Nazis, for all their populist rhetoric, secretly craved: aristocratic legitimacy, international connections, and effortless sophistication. She was a real princess, and she seemed to share their political vision. Stephanie saw Wiedemann as her gateway. Through their burgeoning friendship, and likely a romantic entanglement, she secured what would become the most fateful meeting of her life. In 1933, shortly after Hitler had been appointed Chancellor of Germany, she was granted a private audience with him at the elegant Hotel Kaiserhof in Berlin, which served as his unofficial headquarters. Imagine the scene. The hushed, opulent hotel lobby, teeming with uniformed SS officers and ambitious party officials. And into this world steps Princess Stephanie, draped in Parisian couture, radiating an aura of old-world charm and confidence. She is escorted into the Führer's suite. She finds not a monster, but an awkward, intense man with strangely compelling eyes. But she was a master of reading and manipulating powerful men. She knew exactly how to play him. She didn't challenge him or bombard him with political arguments. She listened. She flattered him, not in a fawning way, but with the subtle praise of an equal. She spoke of her admiration for his achievement in reviving the German spirit. She presented herself not as a supplicant, but as a well-connected aristocrat who shared his desire to see Germany restored to its rightful place in the world. Hitler was utterly charmed. He was a man deeply insecure about his own provincial origins. He was surrounded by gruff, often brutish, party officials. Stephanie was a breath of fresh air. She was a serene highness, a direct link to the glamorous aristocratic world that he simultaneously despised and desperately craved acceptance from. He saw her as his perfect secret weapon. She was elegant, persuasive, and moved effortlessly in the British high society he needed to influence. He believed she could be his advocate, the beautiful, aristocratic face of his regime in a country he desperately wanted to either befriend or neutralize. After that first meeting, he began to refer to her with genuine affection as his Liebe Prinzessin, his dear princess. Some in his inner circle even began to call her Hitler's angel. And so her new clandestine career began. She became, in effect, a one-woman public relations and intelligence gathering firm for the Third Reich. Her new role was formalized and funded. She received a regular and very generous stipend directly from the Nazi regime, a fund personally managed by the high-living and powerful head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring. Her mission was twofold. First, to soften the image of the Nazis in Britain, to convince the skeptical British aristocracy and political class that Hitler wasn't a warmongering monster, but a reasonable statesman with legitimate grievances. Second, to gather intelligence, not necessarily state secrets, but what is now called human intelligence, the mood of the country, the private opinions of key politicians, the gossip from the most exclusive dinner parties, the fault lines within the British establishment that the Nazis could exploit. She threw herself into this work with a passion. She became a crucial bridge between London and Berlin. She used her long-standing relationship with Lord Rothermere to arrange a personal meeting between the press baron and the German chancellor, an event that resulted in a series of shockingly favorable articles about the new regime in the Daily Mail. She became the go-to person for any high-ranking Briton who wanted an introduction to the Nazi leadership. She shuttled a steady stream of influential guests to Germany, politicians, journalists, and even members of the British royal family, including the pro-German Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII, and his brother, the Duke of Kent. She would ensure they were given the grand tour, that they saw the gleaming new autobahns and the happy, cheering crowds at party rallies, and that they were shielded from the darker realities of the regime, the persecution of the Jews, the brutal suppression of dissent, the growing power of the Gestapo. For her loyal service, she was rewarded beyond her wildest dreams. In 1936, a grateful Führer presented her with a magnificent token of his esteem, Schloss Leopoldskron, a stunning Rococo palace on the shores of a lake in Salzburg, Austria. It was, ironically, the same palace that would later become famous around the world as the Von Trapp family home in the film The Sound of Music. The palace had been seized from a Jewish family, a fact that seemed not to trouble Stephanie in the slightest. This castle became her personal court. She spent a fortune renovating it, turning it into a lavish stage for her political theater. She hosted spectacular parties where high-ranking Nazi officials like Hermann Göring would mingle with European aristocrats, British politicians, and international financiers. It was at these gatherings that she did her most effective work, brokering deals in the drawing room, gathering information over cocktails, and building bridges between the Nazi elite and the outside world. She was at the absolute pinnacle of her influence. She had a title, a palace, a direct line to one of the most powerful and feared men in the world. She had played the game, and it seemed she had won, but the price of her victory was a complete and total moral capitulation, a pact with pure evil. She seemed either unable or unwilling to see the true nature of the regime she served. She dismissed reports of Nazi brutality as communist propaganda. She laughed off concerns about the concentration camps. When friends expressed horror at the vicious persecution of the Jews, she would parrot the Nazi line about solving the Jewish problem. It was a staggering betrayal, not only of common decency, but of her own hidden heritage. It was as if, to serve her new masters, she had to surgically remove a part of her own soul to deny the very blood that ran in her veins. Perhaps she simply didn't care. The jewels, the castles, the private planes, the intoxicating proximity to absolute power, it was everything she had ever wanted. It was the ultimate protection. She had built a fortress of luxury and influence around herself, a fortress that insulated her from the inconvenient truths of morality and the suffering of others. She was Hitler's angel, living in a gilded paradise, blissfully unaware that she was dancing on the lip of a volcano, and that the entire world was about to be consumed by the flames. For a few glittering, morally bankrupt years, Princess Stephanie had danced on the edge of a volcano, but in the autumn of 1939, it finally catastrophically erupted. When Germany invaded Poland and Britain declared war, the world that she had so masterfully constructed came crashing down around her with breathtaking speed. Overnight, her greatest asset, her intimate personal connection to the Nazi leadership, became her most dangerous liability. She was no longer a glamorous, unofficial emissary. She was the agent of an enemy power, a suspected fifth columnist in a nation now fighting for its very survival. Her sophisticated double game was over. The time for whispering in drawing rooms had passed. The time for bombs and bullets had begun. MI5, the British Domestic Security Service, had never trusted her. Their files on her, which had been growing for years, were thick with damning reports of her activities, her meetings, and her pro-Nazi sentiments. A now famous British intelligence assessment from 1938 had been chillingly prescient, calling her a highly dangerous woman on account of her cleverness, her range of contacts, and her unscrupulousness. With the outbreak of war, she went from being a person of interest to a prime enemy suspect. The Dorchester Hotel suite, once her glittering command post, now felt like a trap. Her powerful friends, including Lord Rothermere, began to distance themselves, terrified of being tainted by their association with Hitler's princess. She was trapped. With her Austrian passport, she was now technically a citizen of the German Reich, an enemy national on British soil. Realizing she was in imminent danger of being arrested and interned, she made a frantic escape. Leaving behind most of her possessions, she fled England, the country that had been her stage for 2 decades, a country that now viewed her with deep suspicion and contempt. She made her way to the United States, which was still officially neutral in the conflict. She arrived in San Francisco in late 1939, hoping to find refuge and perhaps a new stage for her talents. She still had her title, her jewels, and a dwindling supply of cash. She tried to recreate her old life, holding court in luxury hotels and attempting to charm a new set of powerful American men. But she could not escape her past. Her reputation had preceded her. J. Edgar Hoover, the formidable and almost pathologically suspicious head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, became personally obsessed with her case. He saw her not as a washed-up socialite, but as the cunning mastermind of a Nazi spy ring operating on American soil. He believed she was here to influence American public opinion against joining the war and to gather intelligence for Berlin. Hoover put her under immediate and intense surveillance. The FBI files from this period, now declassified, paint a vivid picture of a woman growing increasingly desperate. Her every move was watched. Her phones were tapped, her mail was intercepted and read, and a small army of agents was assigned to interview everyone she came into contact with. The files detail her frantic attempts to use her old tricks of charm and influence. But the doors that had once flown open for her in Europe were now slamming shut in her face. Powerful Americans were wary of her. The political climate was shifting, and public sentiment was turning decisively against Germany. Her name, once a fixture of the society columns, was now splashed across the front pages of American newspapers for all the wrong reasons. The press branded her Hitler's spy princess, a beautiful but deadly femme fatale, a modern-day Mata Hari. The glamour that she had cultivated so carefully had curdled into notoriety. She was a celebrity, but of the most infamous kind. The attention she had always craved had become a scorching, inescapable spotlight. The pressure mounted. She moved from city to city, from San Francisco to New York, constantly looking over her shoulder, trying to outrun the FBI and her own reputation. Her funds began to dwindle. The lavish lifestyle was becoming harder to maintain. She was becoming isolated, a pariah in a country that was growing to hate everything she represented. Then, in March of 1941, 9 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor would officially bring America into the war, the game was officially over. On the personal order of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had been briefed by Hoover on the perceived threat she posed, the FBI made their move. Agents arrested her in her hotel. She was officially declared an enemy alien, a dangerous agent of the German government deemed a threat to the national security of the United States. The humiliation was absolute. This was the woman who had dined with kings, who had been gifted a castle by Adolf Hitler, who had dictated terms to press barons. And now she was being treated like a common criminal, her photograph taken for a mugshot, her belongings searched, her dignity stripped away. The gilded cage she had so carefully constructed for herself over a lifetime had finally become a very real one, with bars of steel. She was sent to an internment camp for enemy aliens in Philadelphia, and later transferred to another facility in Texas, where she would remain for the duration of the war. Imagine the psychological shock. She was thrown in with a collection of other German and Italian nationals, people she would have considered utterly beneath her in her old life. The silks and jewels were replaced by a simple prison uniform. The champagne and caviar were replaced by basic camp rations. The endless stream of powerful admirers was replaced by stern-faced guards and the company of other outcasts. It was in this bleak environment that her carefully constructed persona completely shattered. The woman who had thrived on admiration and power was now utterly powerless. The extreme nervous tension that officials had noted upon her arrest devolved into a full-blown psychological collapse. It was here, in the desperate confines of the camp, overwhelmed by the totality of her downfall, that she tried to take her own life, not once, but multiple times. The details are grim and sad, desperate acts carried out with whatever means she could find. These were not cries for attention. They were the actions of a soul that had lost everything it had ever valued. She had gambled her entire life on a game of power and prestige, and now, with the board overturned and all her pieces scattered, she saw no reason to go on living. She survived, but something inside her was irrevocably broken. The brilliant, ambitious princess was gone, replaced by a bitter, depressed, and terrified woman. The world she had worked so hard to conquer, the world of power and privilege, had not just rejected her, it had locked her away and thrown away the key. For the next 4 years, as the world war she had helped to enable raged across the globe, she could do nothing but sit and wait in her prison, a ghost haunted by the memory of a life that had turned out to be nothing more than a spectacular, self-inflicted ruin. In May of 1945, as the world celebrated the final collapse of the Third Reich, Princess Stephanie von Hohenlohe was quietly released on parole. The war was over. Her Nazi patrons were either dead by their own hand like Hitler, or awaiting trial for monstrous war crimes like Goering. The ideology she had so eagerly served was now universally reviled as the most evil in human history. She emerged from her internment a broken woman, stepping into a world that had no place for her and no pity. She was 48 years old, but the ordeal had aged her beyond her years. Her name was now synonymous with treason and collaboration. Her first and most desperate goal was to reunite with her son, Franzl, but their relationship had been another casualty of her choices. Franzl had spent the war years in America, living under the heavy shadow of his mother's notoriety. He was the son of Hitler's spy princess, a stain that had complicated his life and career prospects. While a reunion did occur, it was strained. The easy adoration of his childhood was gone, replaced by a more complex mix of duty, resentment, and sadness. She had sacrificed everything for her ambition, and in the end, she had damaged the one human connection that had ever truly mattered to her. Stephanie was now stateless and nearly penniless. The Americans wanted her out of the country. The British would not have her back. Her castle in Salzburg, Schloss Leopoldskron, had been confiscated by the Allied authorities. She was a ghost, drifting through the ruins of a post-war Europe she no longer understood. For a time, she settled in Germany, a nation struggling to come to terms with its own catastrophic guilt. And here, in a final astonishing act of audacity, she tried to play the game one last time. She attempted to reinvent herself. She sued for the return of her property, claiming she had been a victim of the Nazis, not a collaborator. She argued that she had used her influence with Hitler to help people, that she had been a moderating force. It was a staggering display of the same self-deception and manipulative charm she had always possessed. She managed to gather a new circle of admirers in post-war German high society, men who were fascinated by her stories of the inner circle of the Third Reich. She even struck up a close relationship with powerful figures like Axel Springer, the influential head of the German media empire. For a brief, flickering moment, it seemed as if she might claw her way back to some semblance of her former influence. But the world had changed too much. Her past was too well documented, her name too toxic. Her attempts to regain her fortune and status ultimately failed. Her relationship with her son deteriorated further, becoming one of bitterness and recrimination, particularly over money. He saw her as a destructive force in his life, while she saw him as ungrateful. The final tragic break was almost inevitable. She would spend her last decades almost completely estranged from him. Her final years were a slow, sad descent into obscurity. She settled in Geneva, Switzerland, a city of quiet, neutral efficiency, the absolute antithesis of the dramatic, high-stakes worlds she had once inhabited. She lived in a small, elegant apartment, a lonely and forgotten figure. The great beauty had faded, leaving behind the harsh lines of disappointment. The famous charm, which could no longer open any doors of consequence, soured into a corrosive bitterness. She was haunted by what she had lost, and perhaps, though she would never admit it, by what she had done. The woman who had thrived at the vibrant, chaotic center of world events now lived on its absolute periphery. The depression that had first taken hold of her in the Texas internment camp became her constant companion, a long gray twilight of the soul. She granted a few interviews, always trying to spin her story, to cast herself as a misunderstood player in a great historical drama. But few were listening anymore. She was a relic of a dead and disgraced era. Princess Stephanie von Hohenlohe died in her Geneva apartment in 1972 at the age of 80. It was a quiet, unremarkable end to a life that had been lived at full volume, a life filled with palaces and prisons, kings and dictators, glamour and utter disgrace. So who was she, in the end? The Nazi princess? The master spy? The tragic victim of her own ambition? She was all of them, and yet none of them entirely. She was a survivor who, in her desperate scramble for security, made a catastrophic moral choice. She was a woman of immense talent, intelligence, and ambition, who directed all of her formidable gifts towards the hollow, selfish pursuit of status. She built a glittering world for herself, a fortress of luxury and influence, but it was nothing more than a gilded cage, and she was its only lonely prisoner. Her story is a profound and unsettling tragedy. It is not the story of a monster, but of a deeply flawed human being who flew so close to the sun of absolute power, not out of ideological passion or fervent belief, but simply for the warmth of its glow and the prestige it conferred. And when her wax wings inevitably melted, she fell into a sea of darkness, leaving behind only the ghost of a princess and a chilling, timeless lesson about the terrible human price of a life lived without integrity.